Everybody, and thank you very much indeed for coming this evening. So my name's Owen Kelly and I'm Director of Engagement here at the University of Edinburgh Business School, and we are delighted to be working again with the David Hume Institute, one of our most valued partners in these kind of events, because part of the role of the business school is not only to bring people together to talk about policy issues and other things, but also to engage in public debate. So thank you all for coming. I have one piece of formal business to mention, which is that there is no fire alarm planned. So if you do hear a fire alarm, then that is the exit there, and the staff, if you just follow the member of staff, they will make sure you're okay. So my role here at the business school, I'm Director of Engagement. My academic background is actually in philosophy, but it's part of my role to try and encourage collaborations with a wide range of actors across the economy. And as I say, it's great to be able to be collaborating today with the David Hume Institute. So what I would like to do very quickly is mention a couple of other events we've got coming up. As I say, we have a pretty busy programme, but there's one in particular I wanted to mention to this audience happening on I haven't written down the date here, that's not very helpful, is it? If you look on our website, we are having an event with the RSPB, another partner of ours, and it's called Banking on a Wilder Tomorrow, and it involves a film that's been specially made with leading figures in the finance industry talking about the value from a financial perspective of wildlife, and it's going to be it's on, I think, the 6th of December. So I just wanted to draw that one to your attention. So this evening we have three very, very valued contributors. We'll hear in a minute first from Professor Jan Bebbington, who is the Director of the Pentland Centre at the University of Lancaster. And she's at the forefront of sustainable development and accounting scholarship, and has published on a very wide range of topics relating to the Sustainable Development Goals. She's also involved in a very long-term collaboration at the Stockholm Resilience Centre at the University of Stockholm. But in common with our other speakers this evening, she's also engaged outside academia with the world of practice. And I think all of the contributions this evening will, in their different ways, reflect that. She was the Vice Chair in Scotland of the Sustainable Development Commission, and she's also currently on the Scottish and Southern Energies Sustainable Development Fund. After her, we'll hear from Professor Ian Thomson. He is now Professor of Accounting and Sustainability at Dundee University after 7 years at the University of Birmingham. He's 25 years publishing on a very wide range of related topics, and has been, and has been an expert witness at many parliamentary committees. And finally, responding to their presentations, we'll hear from my colleague here, Dr Sarah Ivory. So I will immediately now hand over to Jan. Thank you. Sorry.
That's all right.
Thank you.
You want this for the recording, don't you?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank
you
you
so much. Okay. Well, Ian and I have a great deal in common. We sort of started our careers at the same time, and I'm not going to say how many years we have between us because we counted it up a wee while ago and we were horrified. So I've got a due to retire. So I've got a degree from Dundee University, that's where my PhD's from, and now Ian is there. It was also the place where the Centre for Social Environmental Accounting Research started as well, so probably about 25, 30 years ago. So we're both members of that community of scholars who are accountants, who are trying to think about what that means for organisations. As I say, I run the Pentland Centre for Sustainability in Business. I'm also a trustee of the David Hume Institute, and Ian's middle name is Hume. So there we are. We went all out. We went all out for this to try to get all the connections across in that respect. So what I'm going to do today is a bit of a provocation. So I put provocation there, really just to clue you into it as a provocation, because stewardship is a bit of a provocative word. For some people it feels like really sensible. It feels like it's about stewarding our natural resources. It's quite an old-fashioned notion in some way, but with that old-fashionedness, it's also sort of got a wee bit of maybe patriarchal sort of I know best and now I'm going to tell you kind of things to do with it. There's also a sense in which putting corporate and biosphere together is a bit of a provocative mix, because you think, well, what on earth has a biosphere got to do with corporations? And I hope that by the end of our conversation you'll realise everything, because of course everything draws on the biosphere and everything goes into it, so it's not something we can organise our way out of. So the way we're going to sort of run through this is, the step one is the context, which I'm not going to spend any time on at all. I don't think we need to rehearse the extent to which nature is in crisis mode. For those folk who were at the Macaulay lecture sort of a week and a half ago or so, I think Johan Rockström sort of summed it up really well. As we phase out of fossil fuels, we're leaning more heavily on nature. We're actually substituting more nature in at that stage. It's also the case that as climate change runs through the system, nature and biological resilience is going to be really strongly threatened as well. But at the same time, nature is the buffer for climate change as well. So behind anything that you might care about, nature and then the living part of the world that we live in, the biosphere part of nature, is there to help organise and support anything that we want to do. Everything comes from the natural environment in some ways, everything goes back there. And in particular, with regard to water, water's central to that question as well. So it's all tucked in there together as a system that generates both materials that you might want as a company, i.e. dependencies, and on which companies have an impact as well. So it's there as the sort of the full bit. So I'm going to basically talk about infrastructuring as a verb, which I'm sure will horrify anyone who's interested in grammar, in terms of how do these things hook together and work together in order to be able to create biosphere stewards who are also corporations. So I've got some practical examples. I think I've got some hopeful practical examples, but I'd like to say they are the exception. It's not the mainstream we're going to be actually looking at. And then Ian's going to look at more biosphere as critical infrastructure, this time as a noun, so you can relax, and because we'll get back to nouns at the end of the day. So usually in an academic chat, we sort of build up to the statement of what we're after, but I'm going to start with it, because what we want is we want to think about what comes together, what various elements come together in infrastructure, the idea of corporate biosphere stewardship. And these are a list that's been developed out of quite a few papers and quite a few on-the-ground experiments to try to figure out what do you need. So the first one is much higher level, and in some ways the Sustainable Development Goals sort of try to give us some sense of that vision alignment. What is the thing that we're after? And society and corporations have to come to some common agreement about what it is that collectively we want. Then you need frameworks to support that. So there's no point thinking I'd like corporations to steward the biosphere and then not provide any governance frameworks or any pricing signals or any way of actually regulating that relationship. And so you need these frameworks to support the pursuit of these things. Some of the newer frameworks that are coming in are things like the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, using disclosure as one of the framing devices. The Science-Based Target Initiative would be another one, and there's any list of them, a huge long list of people who are trying to do that. If those things come together, that is, if they coalesce and create a governance infrastructure, then you've got a bit of a possible transformation in the license to operate. But that's not a single direction transformation, that the rules change and then everyone changes behind them, but it's a multi-directional relationship. So consumers will need to change how they think about things, what they buy, whether or not they buy things or they buy services, etc. Likewise, how they might express that in a market through product certification, through price premiums, through maybe collectively purchasing the food, through various sort of consumer investments in agriculture would come into that. But likewise, again, more regulatory things around that as well, which could extend all the way out to the likes of how stock exchanges decide what information they want from companies, how they design risk into their evaluation. And there's something called the Sustainable Stock Exchanges Initiative, which is quite amazing, and that's where all the regulators of the stock exchanges have got together to say, these are the kind of rules that we need all the stock exchanges to adopt in order to be able to identify and manage risk. Risk at the moment which exists, but which is hidden because it's in nature, and that's not something that we typically can identify and work with. Likewise, the financial sector is critical to this. So whether or not it be how people arrange loans or how they finance certain kind of activities, it might include biodiversity credits and offsetting, which I feel very uncomfortable about, mainly I think out of ignorance, but mainly also out of a bit of worry as to what that means and how do we trade them and what that could look like. But at the moment, people are trying to invent those processes and those tools as we go through. And then you need to know stuff. So you've got that need for radical transparency and the ability to know what's happening where in the world, and then what is the impact on nature that comes from that. So it's the transparency and then the translatability. So any company, well, not any company, a company with a bit of work can tell you where they're operating and what they're doing, but it's another step again to say, what does that mean in ecological terms? But that step can be taken and is being taken. And then finally, because ultimately, I am an accountant, accountability through disclosure. And this is where we might move from accountability towards information for stewardship. So how have you not just done the things that you're due to do, but how have you increased resilience in the place where you're operating in the world as well? So stewardship is quite an old-fashioned notion for accountants. We used to be into stewardship until about the 1980s or so, when we went into decision usefulness. And so all the information is it useful for making this decision? Before that, we were really concerned about, are we properly stewarding financial resources? Now there's a lot more to look at and try to understand in terms of stewarding. So who could be a steward? And this is where I would argue that it's not a single company activity, although a single company can be really responsible and can be very thoughtful about what they do, but rather I would argue that there needs to be some gathering together of people who would be able to steward natural resources. And where some of this language comes from is a very pivotal paper that was produced in 2019 that looked at who are the companies who between them mobilise most of the resources in the world. And you can see from this, you're looking at agri-chemicals, you've got seafood, you've got agriculture and forestry. And the numbers in the smaller circle are the number of companies, so 10 companies have 83% of the animal pharmaceuticals. That means if those 10 change how they operate, the whole sector changes. So this is what we've been looking for, is keystone patterns in particular industries. 4 companies have 84% of the pesticides. We can get 4 people together and have a chat to them. That's possible. Yeah? So it's not like it's not hundreds and thousands of companies, although there are hundreds of thousands in these industries, but the big actors who are invariably transnational, so they operate all across the world in a whole variety of different regulatory contexts, are the people who can start to actually affect change. Over on the hard side, you've got all the fossil fuels and the other mining and minerals. Between them, it's just under 200 companies. You get 200 company CEOs in a room. So this is our model of change that I've been working on with the seafood people, because we're obsessed about the 2 wee bits of blue in the middle there, to say who are the owners and then who are the leaders of companies who, if they change, the whole system changes. And that's what we mean by stewardship, because they're doing things not just for themselves, but for their industry more broadly. So that sectorial approach is bringing together people with common interests, with common problems, to actually explore them and try to resolve them. And all the collaboration science tells us that if you get more than 15% of a market or of a cohort of people changing their behaviour, it creates a cascade effect. So that collaboration, you don't have to have 99% of the people to agree, you need the leading edge with about 15%. But in industry terms, 15% is still quite a large number to draw together. So here's another example of another attempt at a keystone process. So this one is really different from the other one in that it's focusing on the ocean. And if there's nothing else you learn from me, there are no oceans, there's only one of them. It's the ocean, it's all connected together. So whatever you do in any one part of it, you're in the ocean. So it makes things easier. I don't think it will ever win in Trivial Pursuits, but there we have it. So this is a different set of keystone companies. So what this is the 100 largest companies in 10 sectors. So these companies aren't anywhere near the same size, and you can see it from the drop-off there. And the dark is all the oil and gas companies. So they're the real big guys in this particular cohort. But what we're interested in this study was to bring together people who operate in a common space and who might have to collaborate in order to be able to protect the biosphere and the space that they're operating within. So the offshore wind and the tourist industry and the people who are doing all the communications tools, they have to make it work in one place. They may also have competing demands. So not in here because they were too small at the time, but the guys that want to mine the seabed, okay? You don't want to put them next to the cruise tourism folk, okay? So what we were trying for here is a really diverse group of players that are in the same space. We then tried to put a group of them together in the first instance to have a look at blue carbon. So this is the carbon offsets that are available by different management of the marine space, whether that be mangroves or seagrass, etc., etc. And so a group of scientists helped them sort of grapple with that, and then they took all our knowledge and they ran off and said, we'll do it on our own, thanks, because we're trying to get them to do it together. So this is a really interesting example that currently is not working because these guys don't want to be keystone actors together. And that language is quite self-conscious, so it comes from the idea of a keystone species as a metaphor for how a physical system works. So the guys at the top, so when you reintroduce wolves into Yellowstone, they restructure the environment. We would say these are the economic equivalent, the guys that structure the environment, and if they change, they restructure it. So I share this example because it's currently not working. We've not quite given up on it yet, okay? But it's a tough one because of disparate interests, and quite a bit of competition over the same ocean space as well. One of the things we really like about this, though, is that we figured out which are the ports that matter. So ports, it turns out, are really novel governance entities in the global ecosystem because everything eventually goes through a port. So if a port either requires information or requires certain actions, then it happens. So one of the things that is, again, a governance thing is that countries are gradually signing up for something called Port States Measures Agreement, which means you can't land fish unless you can prove it was legally caught. And that means that the 20% of fish that's currently illegally caught can't be landed anywhere. If you can't land it, you don't pick it. Okay, so it's a way of governing this space. So that's a really different kind of actor. The examples I'm going to show you of what people have been doing in this space are drawn from this experiment. So this is those guys in the big circle, the wild capture and the farmed people. So this is an example of a keystone actor cohort that has stuck together. So this is 9 companies who collaborate together to deal with a series of commitments that they've made about natural resources, so no IUU in their own operations or along their supply chain, as well as social issues, no forced labour in their own activities all along their supply chain, which is a big ask because forced labour is endemic in the seafood industry, tackling global climate change, tackling plastics in the ocean, no catching of endangered species. So you think this is all quite low-hanging fruit, but this is not guaranteed fruit. Okay, so these are really sensible things to do. They've been working together for about 6 years, and I'm part of a science team that brings knowledge to them in CEO-level briefings so that the CEOs can grasp the essence of the problem and also what the literature is saying about what they ought to do. And at the same time, we research how they go about this. They've got about 10% of the global catch between them. So 9 companies catch 10% of the wild fish. That means, again, if they change, the system changes because they're global, vertically integrated, and operate around the globe. So I've got 2 examples from this cohort where they've tried to do that linking through, what I call infrastructuring, in terms of creating traceability, translating it through into something that can be used so we can actually start to do some biosphere stewardship. So the first example is from Maruha. Has anyone heard of Maruha? No, never have you? Okay. So they're not on a product, so you won't see them in that way. They are 50% larger than the next smallest firm. So this is the largest seafood firm on the planet. It's based in Japan, and they are massive. So they mobilise about 1.4 million tonnes of seafood, amongst other food as well. And what's quite interesting is that we've never heard of them, and yet they are definitely in our supply chains. And indeed, in this cohort of companies, 3 of them are Japanese, 2 of them are Thai, 1 South Korea, and there we haven't even really hit any names that you'll know yet. And then one of them is a Norwegian and one of them is a US company. So it's a really different cohort of companies than the ones we usually think of. What Marua has done, and it took them 2 years to do this, and it takes any decent-sized firm a couple of years to do this, is that they've surveyed everything that they catch and everything that they buy as to what species is it, where did they get it from, and how much did they get. And so they've got a real physical map of what their biomass, which they're acquiring out of the ocean, is. And you'd say, well, why didn't they know this already? Surely everyone knows it. No, they don't. They just buy fish. They never wrote it all down to look at it from a biological perspective. So they had to reanalyse all of their materials. And what you end up here is their estimation of how ecologically sound that catch is, which they are then selling. So they've got about 1.4 million tonnes. They think 1.06 million is healthy, of which some of it's certified. So this will be Marine Stewardship Council certified. So we already have market devices in the system that provide information about the ecological state of what people are catching. If it's in the forest, then it'll be, Forestry Stewardship Council. In the oceans, it's the Marine Stewardship Council. And then this is how you know it's a decent account, because what they don't know is also in their account. So they know that 100,000 tonnes of it is not healthy, and then they know that they've not got data on a whole bunch of others. So what they then present, and this is in the public domain, this is not secret, okay? But I guarantee you've never read their sustainability report. I love it, but no one else reads them. So here is what they're not healthy, is that they tell you what it is, and then the data deficient is this stuff here. Now, I don't know about you, but I have no idea what a Japanese short neck clam is, other than it's probably got a short neck, and it's a clam. And it speaks Japanese. That's all I know. So for us as report users, we need some way of translating that kind of information into something which is understandable and amenable to a user, or to a bank, or to a customer, or somebody in their industry. So this is the traceability bit, identifying what everything is, where it's come from, and how healthy is it. So how do they get to the healthy? What they do is that they use information intermediaries, just like stock markets do, to make that translation between what they're catching and what it means. But before we go there, we'll just go into this as well. So they tell you how many threatened species they're handling. You might think, well, shouldn't that be 0? Well, maybe, but it's not. So at least I've been clear about it. And then they're saying about where it comes from, and then also what kind of management action might be in place. So some of it they're looking to phase out entirely, other ones are under fisheries improvement programs. So FIPs are when people get together to try to rebuild a stock. So it's a way of trying to underpin the ecological integrity of what they're doing. But here's the information intermediaries. And they're from the likes of the Sustainable Fisheries Partnership, who produce something called the Ocean Disclosure Platform. So what the scientists do is that they look at fish. Obviously, absolutely obsessed by fish. So if there's any fish you like, do not ask me about it, okay? Otherwise, you might not ever eat it again. So no, don't ask about fish. What this science platform does is it identifies species and places. So like a pollock in this place will be very different from a pollock somewhere else. And this is one of the essence of the difficulty of being a corporate body dealing with the biosphere, is that it depends on where it is. It's not the same as global climate change, whereas if you cut the emissions, you're probably doing all right. This really matters where you are. What the platform then does, and I've put a small company in here because it's easier to sort of navigate, is that this company catches out of 7 fisheries, of which 6 of them are deemed to be well managed, and 1 of them is in need of improvement. What they then do is they then provide information about how does that come about. So a company will sign up to this and they'll get this information. And this is all public domain stuff as well. So for the Atlantic mackerel, they tell you what kind of production methods they've got. So if you're worried about production methods, you can see it off this. And then they've got, in this case, they only have at the moment 2 sources of ecological information, but they want to have more of a range in there. So you see there's a range of opinions and expertise about this particular biological resource. For a comfort for those of you who are eating fish from Co-op, they are also on this. So they've got an enormous number of fisheries spread around the world. They tell you exactly where they all are, they tell you how they catch them, and they tell you the ecological condition of them. So this might eventually make it through when you and I are standing at the fish counter with somebody saying, oh, this is good stuff, that's the poorer stuff. But this is the technology that sits behind corporations who are trying to figure this out for themselves, to make sure that they can be a stewarding influence on the biosphere where they catch their raw materials. And that's because they wish to be responsible, but also they want to have fish in the future. So this is also a dependency question as well. It's not purely an impact question. The final example I'm going to give you is one from Cargill. I don't know, have you heard of Cargill? Everyone kind of thinks they're the evil empire of feeds of various sorts. Cargill is a really interesting company. It's a family-owned company by something like 128 cousins own it. I invite you to think of all your cousins owning a very large multinational with you, and you can imagine, okay, I can tell just by looking at you who's got nice cousins and who are going. So what they are facing is that they are facing boycotts from people who want to buy feeds on the basis that they don't want to buy deforestation-fed feeds. This is also going to be a legal requirement in the EU that very soon you can't import any materials into the EU that's got deforestation behind it. So again, they've spent 2 years trying to figure out where all their feeds have come from, particularly their soy in South America. So here they start off with the ecology, so the biomes in South America and the extent to which they are already deforested. And we know, it's no surprise, there's been quite a bit of deforestation going on there. But then they're trying to understand, well, where are our farms? So they have geospatially located down to a specific part of the planet all of their farms and all of the farms that they buy from. Then they've combined that with satellite data that's generated by the likes of the US Geographical Society to figure out what is the forest cover in that place and when did it change. So their baseline is 2008, and this is when Brazil passed its forest code about deforestation. Of course, the ecological baseline of deforestation is much earlier, but they've picked a legal one, which I think is reasonable, even though you might have wished that the deforestation before 2008 hadn't happened. So what they're able to do from that is to tell you how much of their soy is deforestation and conversion free as a way of knowing what's happening. In this process, and again it's in their report, they got rid of about 200 suppliers because they didn't meet the criteria that they wanted. So you know when people are being credible when they tell you who they no longer buy stuff from, because you can't do this exercise and find, oh, it's all fine. Okay? That's not available as an outcome. And so what they can then do, right down to farm unit and different regions, is to say how much of their soy is deforestation free. This means that in some places, when it's 100%, they want to check those processes, but they can trust them. But where it's lower, that's where they put the management effort to try to sort out those places. And then, along with our fishing colleagues, are not abandoning places, not saying this is a bit nasty, we're leaving, because all that does is give worse actors a place to operate, but they're staying and trying to sort it out in place, and at the same time to be explicit about it and to be transparent about it, so you can make judgments about their ability to be stewards. These guys, though, are the exception. I don't know where it is. I don't know which pocket it's in.
This seems very apt that I follow Jan. It's basically been my career path, just following in her slipstream. It's also very, very difficult to follow the type of work that's actually there. So in some ways, what I want to try and do with this half is to move maybe away from the exceptional and actually maybe try and look at this as on a more kind of like normal basis and how we can actually bring about not just particular change but actually across it. And it's all very well having the keystone actors, but they also depend on other people sort of like acting as well. So it's just kind of interesting that you need somebody to initiate the change, but they also need people to follow. So I want to try and maybe have a look at some of these different things, these different ways of actually looking at it, and particularly maybe trying to give a sense of where I think business biosphere literacy and competencies actually is, which if it was in this university and they were doing an exam, I don't think they'd be allowed to sit the exam. You know, they're kind of often well off the pace. I think what we've got to realise is that every single business has an impact on the biosphere. Every single business has the ability to improve, to make things worse, and every single business has a dependency in it. And every single business, particularly through their value chain, connects different ecosystems in actually kind of very, very kind of like different ways. What Jan's talked about, I think, is exceptional type businesses, exceptional initiatives where people have actually tried to create the possibility of change, to demonstrate, if you like, proof of concept, to then to try and say it can be done if you kind of like want to. But just a little bit, we did a survey at the Centre for Responsible Business about a year ago, where we looked at the different priorities of businesses using the Sustainable Development Goals and other things. Sadly, 4% of UK businesses had anything to do with life underwater, even though when we looked at the connectivity, all of them really kind of like connect down. And 8% of the businesses were integrated life on land. However, they tended to be agriculture or food-based businesses as well. And what you had was you just had big flat zeros across many, many sectors. Particularly even ones which are actually, you know, digging into the ground, pulling shit up and then turning it into stuff that we actually use. They didn't see that as actually sort of like on the biosphere. Technically it's not, because the biosphere is like the surface of the earth. So maybe they're okay if you just like dig through the surface and then pretend you didn't actually touch it. What we have there, if we then look at information that businesses are producing, largely I'd argue that you've got non-disclosure of existential threats to their own business model. Right? We have kind of like self-harm going on in this space, corporate self-harm running in there. And there's a question whether it's non-disclosure or ignorance. I think it would be fair it's a mix of different things. It's often the connectivity between a business and the biosphere is often an area that businesses don't have competencies on, and they're not literate. And so therefore, you know, one of the things we've got to look at is this extent that we're bringing about this change, and we're asking organizations who do not have the competencies, do not have the skills, do not have the literacy, even to interpret a lot of these things, to turn it into action, to turn it into business cases, to request finance and things like that. We have a kind of a situation where we have this business exceptionalism, where businesses consider themselves separate from the kind of the biosphere, yet they're they're sort of like embedded and entangled within kind of like biospheres. And then they also connect. They're a telecoupler now. If you like, the businesses are often the sort of the way in which different things flow. Nutrients flow, resources flow. We kind of like extract kind of like nutrients and biomass from one part of the world and then go. If you don't believe me, just be like, honestly, I am a serious supermarket, where does this come from nerd, right? Right now we've got blueberry. If you're not careful, you're buying blueberries from Morocco, right? And you're buying sort of like stuff from Peru, which may well be fine as long as you know that's what you're actually doing. And a really good example of this telecoupling between kind of business and the biosphere, every time you go in the supermarket, just pick up, you go, sweet potatoes from where? Where's this actually coming from? And actually just think about the resource. And for many ways, for me, a lot of it's about water. We're pulling water from a desert to a place that's really, really wet so that we can have some kind of like some blueberries. But anyway, there's stuff like there. I think kind of Jan sort of like mentioned this bit about this understanding of dependencies, business dependencies. Even at its simplest, if we need employees to be able to kind of like to stand up, to do their tasks, they need nourishment. Like, we're wholly dependent upon the food system. And as we know, the dinosaurs didn't all die from getting an asteroid going on. It's because we then sort of like put some cloud up and the plants died and we wiped out species because of our dependency on different things. We can have positive impacts and we can have negative impacts. When we've looked at kind of businesses, in particular relationship with biosphere, we found that they focus on the negative impact, which at one level is quite good, but often they don't recognize where they've got the potential to make a positive impact on the biosphere, and they certainly do not have a sense of their dependency, which drives serious risks in their business model, because they're not actually looking at their source. And the other thing is that whilst we're talking about bioliteracy, and we all know we've got unknown unknowns, known unknowns, and all that, when you look at the science, the known knowns is enough to justify action. We don't need any more information. We have a robust scientific basis which actually identifies the kind of the problems there. It's often just not integrated with kind of corporate activity, or forms part of the appropriate regulation of it. And I mean, Jan talks about the ocean fisheries, and the ocean fisheries are kind of one of the last places where there is no kind of like formal kind of like governments. It's the high seas. It's like where pirates can do all sorts of stuff. I mean, just some of the examples on business biofuel relationship. Where have we got problems? We have simplification of landscape. Here, what we're talking about, monoculture. Here, we're actually moving about, like our foodstuffs. So we used to kind of like have our, the 80-20 rule. We had kind of a whole range of different things. We're now down to about 6 main stocks. We've got stuff like rubber, where I think we're based on one genus of one tree, and one disease could wipe out all of the rubber. Some interesting studies on what happens if you can't get any rubber, because I think virtually all the rubber comes from one grafted plant. So in the pursuit of profit, what we've typically done is we've modified, we've simplified, we've pushed things in to maximize the kind of extract on a particular set of assumptions, which actually is reducing biodiversity. We've got alien species. We've got all of these different things happening, which actually is sort of like at one level creating some short-term kind of like cost reduction, some short-term sort of like maybe increase in yield, at the expense of the destruction of the underlying system that's actually there. And that's very much, I kind of think, if we're looking at economics, that's where we've actually got a market failure, because we've actually got these different things. We're releasing greenhouse gases, which are having knock-on effect. We're disrupting the biogeochemical cycles, phosphorus, atmospheric acidification, there's a whole range of these different things. We're disrupting freshwater cycles. We're pulling out water. Avocados. How much water is one avocado? I mean, it's just like insane that we're actually doing that, and sort of like...
There'll be nothing left to eat after this.
You can eat avocados. Avocados grown quite naturally don't actually need 200 litres of water for one avocado. If you buy them in season, and if you want to have a global, you want to have your Nigella mashed avocado on toast every single morning, which you shouldn't, that's where the problem lies. And it's this thing where we've got products, we've got Biosphere, which actually produces things on a kind of net positive basis that we're actually kind of like, we're turning our back on it and doing the stupid things, okay? We're marine littering, we're reducing system resilience, we're increasing the risks. Now we can do this, it's like there's good business models, they're complicating the landscape. There's not a problem, it's actually about resilience. Now we've got, things like potatoes, we're now going into traditional brands. Apples were coming in. We're getting new brands of different things to come in so that we can protect ourselves against different weather forecasting. We can remove greenhouse gases. Yes, we can, can't we, Matt? We definitely can. We can. We can do it. It's easy, it's cheap. It's not that actually a big problem. You just got to think about it. We can rebalance, we can cleanse, and we can increase system resilience. And I think a really sort of like good analogy to actually think about is to think of nature as an infrastructure, as a critical infrastructure. And there are certain things when we look at infrastructure, infrastructure is great. Everybody likes infrastructure, right? Every government wants it. We want to kind of invest. We want communications. We want transport. We want this. We want that. We love infrastructure, right? And in most cases, infrastructure is a value-creating activity for most people, but nobody wants to pay for it, okay? And this is where we have, when we come to look at infrastructure, often necessary, critical infrastructure, we have this problem because we want it, we know it creates value, but we have this misalignment of interests that nobody wants to pay for it, and then we've then got this cost that people want to kind of incur, and then it kind of like goes on. Nature is very much falls into that thing. Infrastructure is long-lasting. It works in different rhythms. We've got NIMBYs. We've got NIMTO. You know what NIMTO is? Not in my term of office. That's like, so not in my backyard and not in my term of office. And again, you've got to think about it. Who wants to pay for stuff when somebody else gets the reward for it? And often that's, comes in the tragedy of the horizon as well as tragedy of the commons. That what we have within nature, we have something very, very similar to, if you like, to physical infrastructure, but the way in which we kind of manage it, the way in which we fund it, the way in which we maintain it. And even if we were to sort of like spend not that much money really, that's been sort of like controversial, on HS2, right? Transport infrastructure is going to last for a long, long, long time, right? It's going to decay unless you kind of maintain it. And one of the things that we see with infrastructure, and again, arguably, we sort of look at the sewage infrastructure, we've just got to drive around Edinburgh, for goodness sake, for like crumbling infrastructure, the roads, the pipes underneath it, the electricity, the wiring. We've got sort of like, things which are 100, 200 kind of years old that haven't been properly maintained. Because it's always easy to save a bit money on maintenance. It's always easy not to kind of like to replace, to let things go. And I think if we think of nature in the biosphere as a form of infrastructure, and then we look at how potentially we can actively steward it, actively govern it, you cannot have a road system that works without road management, without road government, without some form of planning, with some there. Why are we surprised that nature needs that as well? And so when we need to kind of to look at these different things, we need to look at structures in place. We need to look at this kind of like this infrastructure, as well as the sort of the data and how these things can connect together. It's very much about connectivity. If we can get the connectivity right, if we can get the narrative right, if we can get the relationships right, then we can get the costing right, then we can get the valuing correctly, then we can get the funding, then we can move towards the transition. Right now we've got a lot of kind of dialogue talking about nature-based transition without actually understanding it as a form of infrastructure, without realizing who's connected, who's winning, who's losing, and how we can kind of pull that together. And yes, it does maybe kind of like need, again, being slightly controversial, sustainability isn't hard, it's just different from the way we do things just now. Okay, that often really annoys lots of people, but it's actually, if you were starting from a sustainable perspective, it's quite straightforward. I remember my father, who was a carpenter, and he said, "What is it you do, Ian? What is it you do? Please tell me." And so I tried to explain him about sustainability, and he just said, "Oh, you mean doing it properly?" And that was it. He never, like when he was doing his apprenticeships in the 50s and 60s, you never threw away a bit wood. You always put it in your bag. You never threw away a hinge. You never did anything like that. You always kind of like fixed and did things. And that was actually the kind of like that crafting, that stuff. And that applied across so many different kind of like disciplines. And we've actually moved towards externalizing lots of costs that it's actually seen as kind of like cheaper, but it's cheaper for whom? And this, I just want to sort of like, to maybe kind of move towards a close by looking at an example of a project that we're actually working on, which is quite controversial. But actually it's about working Amazon, it's about working with carbon offsets, it's working with blockchain, it's working with non-financial sort of like non-fungible tokens. It's about looking at satellite images. It's about all sorts of drone stuff. Lots of technology as a way to kind of like to prove things. But what we think is if you do things in a particular way, you can actually create configurations and infrastructure that have the potential to bring about change. Because most of the ideas that we're talking about are actually quite good ideas, fragments of ideas. It's how we put them together in an infrastructure that's actually important. And this is some work that's doing with Amatec Labs, who are a Brazilian social enterprise. That they're leading this kind of project, and their basic premise is how can we create an economy that allows the people in Brazil living in the forest to have a reasonably high quality way of life. That actually they're kind of like rewarded for the things that they actually do. And that they can actually work with people to steward forests. We're looking at the Amazon, we're looking at First Nations in Canada, we're even looking at sort of like forests in the UK as well, about this kind of like this technology to bring things here. Because what we're trying to do with this, and this includes, it's an interdisciplinary thing, so we've got my kind of self as an accountant, we've looking at carbon accounting, we've got forestry scientists, we've got ecologists, we've got development, we've got local communities, we've got policy, we've got finance, we've got data scientists. We're all bringing together with this challenge, which is how can we create a form of biosphere stewardship in the first instance from forestry that actually allows these interconnections to be managed, to be seen, to be visible, to be connected, and actually bring this idea that we have a systemic problem, and much of systemic problems that we have in biosphere is the disconnect between different systems. And what we're trying to do here is try and align the different systems by actually looking at the kind of the broken connections that exist just now with some of our solutions, and then actually trying to re-engineer these connections and make the connections work, and then see if we can actually start to pull things together. And this idea of covalence, which is an important aspect, that's like co-surveillance. It means it's not just that one company giving the information out for people to then. It's about mutual accountability. So we're actually able to get a kind of a network of different accounts of different aspects of the biosphere that we can then create a way in which people can see. So we've got this, something like 360 kind of visibility, and we can actually do things. And we can actually start to look at things where we've got satellite images. We've got kind of like drone fly-throughs. We've got kind of like ground truthing surveys where we actually employ people within the community to confirm different things. Got monitors on trees. Not just monitors, but like they're actually measuring the change in the atmosphere in the forest and actually being able to almost directly measure the carbon dioxide fluctuations as a consequence of a tree growing. Not working on, a tree kind of like on average 10 tons a year, that's it. No, what they're trying to do here is actually actively measure the kind of different biomes, the different stands of trees, and actually measure it. So we can actually look at the methane that comes from the leaf drops. We can look at fluctuations over the year. We can look at different kind of like components, having it there. And we have this idea that we kind of link it all through. We've got oral sound sensors so we can track biodiversity. And we create a kind of like a digital twin where you can actually see the forest. And you've then got kind of carbon offsets and carbon credits that only have value if an underlying tree still exists. If it goes too. Okay. And that's an example of what we're kind of trying to do and trying to bring things to try and get the flow, the finance flow, the investability of this project to actually to work through the system and align it in a different way and try and make sure that the incentives all work together. I'm getting a sense that the time is running out. I think we'll just kind of finish really quickly. There's a lot of stuff going on in this space, particularly in the corporate world. It's a contested space. I think that's one thing that would be fair to say. There's people wanting to get control over it. It's sometimes seen as a good thing because you've actually got the potential, the market for ideas to come round. But it's a space. But the key thing is there's two, I think it's fair to say, we're both accountants, we're involved in this. We think that the accountability is necessary but not sufficient. And what the problem is not the stuff that's on the screen, it's actually all the other parts of the process that goes behind it. That this is just surfacing what's actually sort of going on. I think we'll just leave with the questions that we kind of like started with, and I'll pass over to Sarah.
I've got my own.
You've got your
I'll
own.
turn myself on. Do you want to go back?
Yeah, yes, please.
How's that? Yes?
Yes, sir.
So, yes, I'm going to, I hate that thing, it gets in my way. My name's Dr Sarah Ivory, and Owen apologises for not introducing me fully, but he couldn't speak. So I'm a senior lecturer in climate change and sustainability here at the business school. Importantly, though, I grew up in a town in Australia which is just off the Hume Highway. So it was a different Hume, it was an explorer, but I'm sure there was a connection to David Hume. So I feel like I have a right to be here for that reason alone. I've obviously followed Jan and Ian's work over many years, and one of the frustrating things about them is they just say something that I feel like I can reflect on, and then they answer the question that I was going to ask. But I would like to, they've asked me to do a kind of a reflection of what we've heard, and I'd like to structure it around 4 things. Why not, how, and surely they. And I'm going to go in reverse because I'm going to end on the positive note because I thought Ian was bringing us down a little bit with the negative. Let's start with surely they. I have used this phrase a lot. I've stopped using it now because it's like, surely they know what fish they catch. No, they don't. And not until they actually go and try and find out. Surely they know where the food they feed their fish comes from. No, often they don't know where that comes from. And this has come through in my work for many years. Surely they know where their facilities are located. You would be shocked at the number of multinational companies who don't even know where their factories and other things are in any centralised way. It is changing though, and it's changing partly because of governance, and I'm going to come back to that point in a minute. But the other question that I find interesting is, even if they now know where their facilities are or what fish they catch, they need to go a step further now, because they need to surely they need to know the impact that is having on nature in that space, or the biosphere. And that is ironic that it is very new. The idea that they need to understand the impact is relatively new, not for all organisations, but for many. And that leads me to a second question of literacy, which Ian touched on. Surely they know about bioliteracy. No, they don't. A very important and useful and excellent MBA program that I happen to know about that may be quite close to this building wouldn't even let me put environment on its core program, because I was told that it was an elective, and MBA students who wanted to learn about the environment could do the elective on the environment. Of course, my argument is it's the ones who don't want to learn who probably need to know. And that's not the only MBA that does that, that doesn't put biosphere and environment as core, not because it's a lovely thing to do and we all want to touch trees and, be nice, but because it is a key business issue. So surely they want to be successful businesses, so surely they need to understand the biosphere. I want to move on to why not, and how. First of all, the how. I love the keystone actor idea. It's the first time I've heard that. And I think it's really important that we consider who those keystone actors are. First of all, finding that out, and then how we can go about really getting them to work together. And I'll come back to why and why not. And also Ian's point, how it's not that hard, it's just different, which is what makes it hard, of course, because we're not good at being different for lots of reasons. I sometimes talk about cover your ass business, right? No one fires a CEO who does what the previous CEO did, okay? So you need people who have courage to try something different, which may not succeed. And there's the problem. We're so scared of failure, because as soon as a CEO takes a wrong step now, we want to say, or the shareholders want to say, or society wants to say, well, you stuffed up, you have to go. That's what happens, you resign, right, as soon as you fail. That's a problem for this area, because we need people to fail, or to try something, and then be supported to try the next thing and the next thing. So that's the how things that I got out of these speeches. Unfortunately, my why not list is very long, which is why not act? Why is this corporate biosphere thing not becoming the key of what we do? I heard a lot about working together and this idea that, there's this collective action problem. If it's a collective action problem, we need a collective action solution, and that often means competitors working together. And again, for a moment here, I will just defend businesses. It is very hard for businesses to work against their competitors for lots of reasons, some very legal and regulatory reasons, okay? It's very hard for you to sit in the same room as a competitor. You can't have pricing discussions for fear of collusion. You don't want to release too much information for fear that they'll copy you and you'll wreck your business. Businesses have a really tricky tightrope to walk in relation to collective action. And it's often why we need external organisations, universities, NGOs, to help them navigate that pathway of working together. But also that non-disclosure versus ignorance issue, right? Okay, is it that they're not disclosing it, or is it that they don't know about it? That's perhaps a why not. Is it convenience? And I mean that for consumers. Consumers just find convenient solutions. I'm guilty of it, Ian. I've brought those blueberries because they were on the shelf and I was doing a sort of a recipe that required blueberries. It's a convenience issue, okay? That's why not act, why not? The save money on maintenance is fascinating, and I love this analogy of nature and as an infrastructure. We're very keen to save money on maintenance because you cannot prove that ignoring your maintenance requirements will either save you money or make you money, okay? It's why Deepwater Horizon happened. It's one of the reasons, okay? Because they were able to save money on these processes, these maintenance processes for their deep water drilling rig, and actually it cost them, of course, vastly more. But the day that they were making decisions about that, they didn't know that that was going to cost. And there'll be people cutting corners on other maintenance that pays off in the sense that nothing bad happens. You don't know in advance what maintenance is required and not required for nothing bad to happen. Which actually leads me to the why. And I think this is the heart of these questions. So why should corporates act in relation to the biosphere? So I heard this issue of they're stewards. We should all be stewards, and corporates should be stewards as well. So we should be responsible, just because that's what we should do as humans who have this incredible, terrifying power over the one Earth that is able to hold our life form. The one planet, sorry. But also dependencies. Future resources require that we are stewards of that biosphere. Either because it's direct, if you want to fish an ocean, you need an ocean with fish, or because it's indirect, if you want your workers to work, they need food to nourish themselves. But also because of resilience, that sense in which you may not know what you might need in the future. We talk about that when we're teaching environment all the time. You don't know what crop you'll need in the future, but you should be pretty sure that one crop of rubber is not enough for one world, okay? So where is that sense of resilience? We don't know exactly what we need, but we know we need resilience. We need slack in the system. I also wonder if there's a cultural element here. One of the benefits of being the person reflecting is I don't have to answer the question, but I could ask it. We heard about, Jan, you were talking about the CBOS, Japanese, Thai, South Korean, Norway, US, and many were Japanese. In my own PhD research, what I found was this sense in which why was corporate sustainability integrated into the companies? And I would have people from Japanese companies saying, well, that's just how we were set up. That's just what we do. Like, they almost didn't understand the question because that's how the organisations acted. So I wonder if there's a cultural question there, a legal question on that, an ownership structure question. We can't get away from the fact that shareholders create a lot of problems for companies who may want to act, a lot of problems for CEOs who may want to act. Of course, the reverse is that shareholders can support companies who want to act. But the last one I'd like to end on is this issue of transparency. And Ian, you talked there about this issue of the surveillance or covalence, I think you called it, which I quite like that idea. I'll ask a question about that if no one does. But that issue of covalence and transparency. And it leads me to the question of what transparency is for. And this is where I think we fall apart sometimes. Because I think people do transparency to stop bad people doing bad things. And that's fine and it's good. We should stop bad people doing bad things. We should stop bad companies doing bad things. But actually transparency is also there to reward good things, to provide truth. You know, you talked about ground truthing, to provide evidence of what is effective, what is working, to provide evidence of what's not working for companies who want it to work so they can change. Again, they might fail. And it actually leads me to the last phrase that you said, which was designing investability into transformation projects. And that issue of investability is big. There is more and more money that people want to put into these projects, but it needs to be designed in a way that works for the financial system. For good or for evil, we could argue that it shouldn't have to work for them. But if we want the money to be invested in these projects, we have to design that in. Those are my reflections, and I hope they're useful. Owen, I will hand over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. So we now move to questions, which I will moderate from this vantage point in the corner of the room. So the floor is open. Any questions? Yes, here. Oh, thank you. We're just waiting for the microphone. And if you don't mind, when you have a question, just saying who you are, that would be great. Thanks very much.
You guys can share that.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Afi from Indonesia. I'm doing my master in finance technology and policy, or fintech and policy. But my undergraduate thesis was about sustainability accounting. So, Dr. Bebbington, one of my references for my thesis is actually yours. So, few questions on this matter. Number one, since my background was in accounting, an undergraduate, and my thesis was about sustainability accounting, about the disclosure itself, I learned that non-financial disclosure, like environmental, ESG disclosures, are actually kind of like going to add value for the user of the information itself, be it a shareholder or NGO, stuffs like that. But then, the issue of, you know, in the climate change, you have heard greenwashing every day, where people just trying to be green in order for them to be green, kind of thing. So I was like kind of curious about your perspective on that particular issue, because sometimes I found this company, they're just doing this activity, take the photo and put it in report as if they are doing the whole good things to the society. So and then I want to question the value of steward itself. Like, what's their incentive to be a steward? Because like sometimes, not sometimes, businesses are there for profits. Businesses are there for the market value, etc., etc. So what's the incentive for them to be a steward, and how do we all make sure that this greenwashing issue will at least reduce, right? It's not that we say that greenwashing will never happen, but how to make sure this company are actually responsible for what they are doing. It's not that they don't want, like, we want this company not only to take photo and put it in the report, but make sure there's a good incentive behind it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So 2 questions there.
So, count to 6. I like lots of questions.
One on the value of stewardship and one on
Yeah.
greenwashing.
So I think what you call greenwashing, I call green spotlighting. So here's the one thing that I do well, and I'm going to tell you about it. But there's also something called green hushing, which used to be called brown washing, but that sounds like terrible. So we now call it green hushing, with organisations doing fantastic things and they never tell anyone about it because they're busy getting on with doing it. So I'm not particularly persuaded that everyone's greenwashing. I think it's quite mixed in that respect. In terms of incentives, I can speak for the seafood companies. No fish will survive an unsustainable system. And, you know, for the companies that we're working with, and particularly the Japanese, because of a cultural issue, their CEOs know that they have to be able to actually get out the other side and still be able to catch fish. Most of them have PhDs in fish ecology, so they are really literate. And so I think that was the other fantastic thing. Most of these companies are also quite old. So there is something going on, and we've been looking at it in separate studies about the age of a company correlating with their ability to navigate into the future, to navigate complexity because they've done it before. And we've been talking about and trying to think about, is that a resilience gene? We think that there are secret genes in some of these companies who are able to do things that others can't. And so distilling what that is sort of like a job ahead of us.
Thank you. Ian, you spoke about exceptionalism and ignorance as being behaviours. Is greenwashing part of that, or is it a separate thing?
I think we do need to look at green. There's also green shifting as well, where you shift the blame, which is, it's interesting when you look at a lot of corporate disclosures. It's actually about blaming. It's about blaming your suppliers and blaming your customers and blaming the regulators and blaming everybody. I think one of the things which I think allows us to actually try and look at accountability in a different perspective. Right now we have more information about more businesses than we've actually ever had. Why is it that we rely on the glossy information that a company provides once a year as the ultimate source of truth of what actually goes on kind of within an organisation? That's where kind of like sort of covalence comes in, is we need multiple accounts and we actually look at how these work together in networks of accountability and where we can actually get verification. Again, we you know, sort of like we just go, do you ever rely on a single source of kind of like data to make a significant decision? Or do you look for multiple? You look for kind of like robust things. And I think that myself and Jan were talking about this idea of, in some ways, a radical transparency, which is rematerializing. It's about connecting business accounts of their activity to the actual changes in the biosphere, in the sociosphere, and these different kind of issues. And I would push back a little bit about the idea that companies are about profit maximizing. I don't buy that, right? I did when I was young, but the more experience I've got, businesses are driven by purpose. Businesses are driven by multiple things. If businesses wanted to kind of maximize profit, they would be breaking every law. They'd just be like selling heroin. They'd be just selling stuff like that. But they're not. They're not fully profit maximizing. They're actually, it's a bit more complicated than that, and I think we need to reflect it. And when we look at, a lot of businesses don't grow, a lot of businesses stay stable for long periods of time. And what we really need to do is to rethink about what are the metrics of success of business. And that's where I think a lot of kind of like some of the long-lived businesses already do. But maybe they find it difficult to go, oh no, stand up and say, we're not going to maximize kind of profit. And I mean, you'd have got the pushback. I think it's really sad, so Unilever now, they've now kind of changed their strategy. They said every product's going to have a sustainability purpose. And they've been forced by some activist things to withdraw that from some of their products. But at the same time, they're still going for the vast majority of these different things. So values and value are connected. And it's about kind of like trying to find ways. Sarah,
Thank you. Sarah, do you want to comment?
I've got one here, actually. I would just like to a quick comment on that profit issue. It's not true that business exists to make profit. That's not true at all. Some businesses may prioritise profit. The way I explain profit is that it's the same with, breathing, okay? As a human, you cannot live without breathing. Does that mean you live to breathe? I mean, we don't live to breathe. Breathing is what we need in order to live to do other things. Companies need to profit. They absolutely need to profit. They don't need to maximise profit, which actually is a theoretical construct anyway, because you can never know if you've maximised profit. You can never know. Okay? What if you put your prices up? Would you lose your customers? What if you put them up more? What if you put them up? You can never actually know if you maximised profit. That's another lecture I do. But you need profit, absolutely, but it's what you do with the profit, and it's what your products are doing for the world or to the world that matters. And the purpose shift in business is significant. It's very significant. It doesn't mean they're not bad companies out there, and actually I think the other thing is companies are just people. Companies are all people and legal contracts. And so, people make decisions, and sometimes people make decisions they don't want to make because of structures that they're trapped into. And I think that's worth considering as well.
Thank you very much. I have a question here, gentleman with the glasses, and then we'll come to you.
Thank you. Christoph Harwood. I work in a company called Simply Blue. We work with the oceans on climate change. So we develop offshore wind, wave energy, aquaculture, that sort of stuff. So very interested in part of that. And I was interested in this idea of concentration industry concentration as a tool for change. It takes me on to regulatory capture, but regulatory capture by the good guys rather than by the bad ones, because regulatory capture is normally seen as a bad thing. Is an opportunity for regulatory capture by people doing the right things, which then raises the industry with you? And that's my first question. The second question is there a role for disruptors in forcing through the rest of the industry to take that move to a more sustainable position?
Thank you.
I'll take the disruptor thing. I think absolutely. I think if we look at system dynamics and change, what we don't want is things to be static. If things are static, they're normally dead, and in terms of kind of like working on. And I think there always is a place of disruptors. If you look at the most successful, the richest businesses right now, none of them followed the rules. They were largely disruptors and looking for opportunities and change. I think one of the things that we've been looking at, the longer lasting businesses, is that they are often disruptive themselves because they understand the role of disruption. They understand how that's important to actually to change and to react in different situations. I think there's a massive place, and if you look at complex adaptive system, which underpins a lot of resilience, key thing is disruptors. although the
Can I
disruptors will change.
add to that, and then I know you're going to the other question. On that issue of disruptors, my big concern about disruptors is this societal obsession with never failing, you know, and with cover your ass, right? You never fail, never do anything wrong, and it means we don't take risks. They have to be, you know, well thought through risks, but disruptors will often disrupt something that won't work. And that's okay, and they try a different disruption or they disrupt in a different way. But we need as a society to say, well, that's how things change. They don't change on a perfectly good pathway where we all knew what was going to happen. Sometimes they change in ways we don't expect. And we need more of that positive disruption, and some of it will fail, but we have to accept it.
Thank you. Jan?
I like the idea of positive regulatory capture. One thing we did with these companies is we knew that the World Trade Organization final negotiations on fishing subsidies were coming up. So we were able to attract the attention of the people who were writing the instruments, and we got them to brief our CEOs and then also the operational people as well about what was actually in that treaty. Because what we wanted is our CEOs to collectively have a view about what they thought about fishing subsidies. So it worked in terms of they wrote an open letter. They didn't criticise any government because none of them can do that. So they're very neutral in their political position. And I think what I liked about it is they said, we note that this thing's being negotiated. We have received fishing subsidies over our lifetime. We recognise the time for subsidies is over. And we will cope if you regulate to remove them. And so they, the fishing subsidies have gone. I don't think it was us, to be clear. I think it was the governments in the room. But what it meant is that those who were making the regulation had formal conveyance of the thing. We will cope with your change because it's due. But also not to say, we've always been good, but saying, yeah, we got that. But actually, now's not the time. And so I think that kind of leadership by corporate leaders about the regulatory environment within they sit is really important. And I've never heard the idea of positive regulatory capture, but I shall now steal it and use it at every opportunity. So thank you for that.
Yes, thank you very much. Next question.
Yeah, hi. My name's George. I study a master's here in climate change, finance and investment. Ian, I noticed in a lot of your slides, you're talking a lot about thinking about nature as a critical infrastructure. And I think one thing that you said was it's a value-creating activity for most people, but nobody wants to pay for it. And a lot of the information you put out reminded me of the recommendations of the Dasgupta review, talking about treating the natural world as natural capital, so putting a price on it. What I'd like to know is the panel's thoughts on whether using a natural capital approach is the right solution for a more flourishing biosphere. And my sort of follow-up question would be, what does that look like in practice?
Thank you. Ian, do you want to go first?
I'll have a go. I think there's a nuance in natural capital. There's a nuance in the way in which you might start to kind of devalue some of these things. I think I'd very much be looking at kind of like multiple criteria evaluation, not actually collapsing it. One of the problems we have with a lot of our systems is we tend to reduce things to single dimensions. And when we reduce things to single dimensions, we don't actually see the kind of the spectrum of change or the spectrum of impact. So I think I'd have read the Dasgupta review. There's some good things in it, and there's some crazy-ass stuff in it, and there's some stuff I don't understand. I think the problem with going down to monetizing everything is actually quite kind of problematic. I think you do that as almost as part of a political regulatory kind of like process to drive change. The idea that there is a true price for anything is just simply wrong. I cannot see how you can actually create that. You can create prices and costs which are actually about changing behaviour, and I think that's far more important than this. I think the quest for the perfect price of a natural resource, I think is flawed. I don't think the logic's there at all. But what we need to do is understand the connectivity, understand the risks, understand the consequences, and particularly the consequences for different people within this sort of like ecosystem, so that you actually see who the winners and losers are, and look at the distribution of value, the distribution of harm, the distribution of risks, the distribution of these different things across different sort of like sectors, and moving towards a kind of like a much more multi-dimensional, sustainable kind of like impact. I often sort of like crudely kind of talk about, I'm doing my lectures.
Yeah.
I talk about 17D thinking, like 17 dimensions, and each one's the sustainable development goal. And unless you can actually look at one thing from these different 17 perspectives, you're not going to come up with a sustainable solution. Now, you don't need to monetize everything. You don't need to cost things. You can cost things that you do. And even if you do some costing, you've got to say, what have I not included in that financial calculation? So that even when you're doing the calculation, you go, okay, this one, this one, we've got all these other things are not included in that cost. So I think there's different ways of actually doing it. I think trying to cost things, trying to value things is important, but accepting that you're never actually going to be able to get that.
Thank you. Sarah, do you want to comment? And then
I will. You know I will, Owen, always. So you asked this specific question, is using natural capital, is it the right solution for a flourishing biosphere? The answer is no. I will argue that till I'm blue in the face. No, it is not the right solution. It's a disastrous solution in some ways. But as Churchill would say, it's the only solution we've got. Because our world exists based on these economic principles of where money gets allocated, and we need money to be allocated. Okay, we need money to be allocated. And for money to be allocated, we need some form of pricing. And so if we're going to need it to happen anyway, then we have to make it happen in the way that works best, which is all of what Ian was talking about. People who are literate and who understand that the price isn't the price. What is the price of climate? There's no price for climate. What's the price of the ocean? There's no price of the ocean. There will be a price for a market in which you can trade certain things or invest in certain things. That's a very different thing to actually valuing nature directly. And so for me, then it comes back to the question, why are you pricing it? If you're pricing it because you want to sell something to make as much money as possible, then I'm very, very concerned. If you're pricing it because we need to, Ian, going back to your phrase here, design investability into transformation projects, then fine, I think you can make it work with the right governance mechanisms. So that for me, it comes back to those ideas.
Thank you. Jan, do you want to comment?
No, that's brilliant.
Okay. Next question. We have a question here. Hello, thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Emil. I'm from the Center for Energy Ethics, University of St Andrews. I'm keeping an eye on time. I had 3 questions, but I'll narrow it down to one in the interest of time. And what really strikes me in your presentation, and thank you very much, it was fascinating, particularly in the first part, Jan, is the opportunity there for capturing data. I think businesses are often these kind of underdogs of research, and I work with exploration companies a lot in the mining industry, and just the amount of sheer research that they do about their operating environment, which is the natural environment and has wider applicability and wider use. So the sheer data information, such coordinated approach that I think you're advocating for would generate, creates this amazing opportunity for us to learn about all the systems. Now, my question is about ownership and access to the data. And where Biosphere is reframed as an infrastructure that sustains and enables business operations, how does environmental data sharing work under conditions of commercial sensitivity? And whether this idea about stewardship implying notion of shared and ongoing responsibility would help develop frameworks for that. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for mentioning the time. That will be our last question. But for you primarily, Jan, and then I'll invite the others perhaps to comment, and then we'll move to a vote of thanks.
The CBOS, we never meet as a CBOS without 2 competition lawyers in the room for exactly those reasons. And the companies have different views on how confidential their data is, depending on their own operating environment. So they recently produced an impact report with a standardised data set at the back for each one of the companies, and some of them are going zero data because of commercial confidentiality. So I think people have to make their own decisions about that. This is also where data intermediaries come into play. So people who can take that data, maybe on a confidential basis, and rework it to provide information about a system, then everyone can use. So I think that that's the big win for some places, particularly when there's more than one firm operating in a place, to have someone as the intermediaries. To a certain extent, the science team, and there's like 9 companies, and so there's 9 CEOs, and there's about 4 or 5 operational people for each one of the companies, and there's a set of about 25 or 30 of us doing the science alongside it. So we do some data intermediation for them in terms of, through confidentiality agreements, find out the information and reprocess it in a way that no single company can be identified, but they can all use it, and then make it also publicly available to the industry. So I think the data handling is somewhere else sometimes.
Thank you.
I kind of agree with that. I think I'm maybe slightly more radical. I'm kind of in open data, open sharing data. I think interoperable data. There's lots of open data sources. I think one of the things that I was talking to a macroecologist, and they have what they call a synthesis project, which is just brilliant, because what they do is they synthesize all of the research into kind of usable things in a standard kind of format. I think there's a really strong kind of like thing for us to look at what data is already available, because there's actually lots of data available. It's just poorly used. It's not structured. We need to look at making it interoperable. We need to look at this and creating the not rely. Why do we rely on some of these companies that produce basically shit databases about ESG performance that you should not pay for because it's meaningless in most kind of cases? Why don't we look at this as a scientific process and actually kind of like get some collective kind of activities to collect open data sources that we can then use for the exactly, I mean, I think Jan's example was great about how you can take, here's all the fish that we kill, here's whether it's good to kill them or not. So.
Thank you. Sarah, final comment?
2 brief comments. The first one is, I have only recently become aware of this resource, so apologies for not knowing it in depth. But this is typical universities. A University of Edinburgh academic, who I should know but I've only recently met, named Adam Chalmers, has set up a website called Carrot and Stick. And he is aiming to have as much CSR-type data as he can mine from the internet available for free for anyone. So Carrot and Stick, Adam Chalmers. I haven't looked at it yet myself, so apologies. I have heard it is very good. The last point I want to make, though, is on, you talked about infrastructure, and it wasn't a point I made earlier, but it's just occurred to me, and I see Fran in the room, so I'm going to mention John Elkington, who talked about the triple bottom line, right? And the triple bottom line worked because businesses understood that language, okay? But then it didn't work because, in the end, they didn't really change enough, right? And then John Elkington issued a recall order for his idea. And the nature of infrastructure, or nature as infrastructure, I really like that idea. It's the first I've heard of it. I don't know, maybe I should have heard of it before. But the nature as infrastructure, they made it up. Okay. I really like the idea, but I just have this worry in my head that it is going to go in the same way, in that with infrastructure being a thing that we do to make things most efficient. You know, roads, we want to be efficient infrastructure. And that if we talk about nature as infrastructure, we make it sound like it's just about something kind of simple, mechanical and efficient. And nature should be beautiful and wonderful and have wonders that we don't even understand. I don't want to have to put a price on the ocean. I just want to stand in warmer waters than they have here and enjoy it. And so I just think there's something wonderful about nature as well that we should really remember, and maybe it's a nice sort of note to end on.
I think that is a very nice note to end on. So we're going to go outside and have a drink in a minute, but before that, I'd like to hand over to the Chair of Trustees of the David Hume Institute, Ken Barker, for a vote of thanks.
It should be.
Okay.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. Well, I think we can say that that's actually been a tour de force. It was a subject, I wasn't really quite sure what we were going to be talking about today. And I've learned so much. And I think it was the last questioner who said she had 3 questions. I think possibly that's what's going through her head at the moment. So many interesting ideas brought out. I think you promised us, Jan, that it would be provocative. It certainly has been. My business career was in investment, and I think when I began it, I thought everything could be reduced to cash flows. If you just applied the correct discount rate, then it would spit out a number. Towards the end, it became absolutely clear that investment economics really hadn't found good ways of dealing with the sustainability question. And I think the note of optimism is that the investment community is finally getting round to that, because the younger people in this room today will confirm that that's become incredibly important to those who are saving today. So thank you all very much indeed. And thank you to Sarah for both synthesizing those questions and also throwing in your own excellent aperçu. Thanks to Owen for hosting, and indeed to the whole of Edinburgh Business School. We really value that collaboration at the David Hume Institute, and we hope that it continues for a long time. So if you've enjoyed tonight, if you've taken away some insights into economy, society and policy and would like to know more, I recommend that you look at our website, davidhumeinstitute.org, where you will find more research and future events. And very, very importantly, you'll also learn how to support the work that we do. We can only do what we do thanks to the support of all of our donors. And if you can give anything, preferably on a sustainable, ongoing basis, we would welcome it so much. So with that plea, I'm going to ask you to thank our speakers in the usual way.